There we are. Now we're live.
Excellent.
But we'll forego the intros. Here we are. Safety in numbers and safety in the status quo. Good morning, Richard.
Morning, Keith. I'm afraid B2 is not joining us today because he has tasks to perform,
Ah,
and
right.
she who must be obeyed has told him what he has to do.
True.
Yeah. So I did think that today we could just bitch about him, and I thought that was probably a bit unfair in his absence, even though it's quite tempting. Uh,
Well, we'll actually put it down on the agenda to bitch about him when he's here.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Give him his chance. The right to reply is quite important, of course. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, i- Incidentally,
Sorry, go ahead, Keith.
the Stuart came up on the bus. I think it was yesterday. Yes, it was because it was when John Henty was on, and he reported that the bus to County Hall was absolutely jammed with people, and in talking to them, they were all going in to support the latest plan for the Phoenix Centre. In other
Oh,
words,
right.
it looked
Yes.
as if the Greens were trying to get a lobby going, and that disturbed me a little bit because I really think that democracy is in short supply at the moment with various lobby groups, and we shouldn't succumb to them locally. What's your view on lobbying?
Well, it's wrong to stop people doing it as long as there are people who are able to argue on the other side, I think, really. And I'd seen about the proposals for the Phoenix Centre, and as you know, there have been various plans in the past that have fallen away. Um, but it's a difficult one because, as I understand the current plans, it's for housing. But a difficulty about that is that the developers say, oh, it will be lots of lovely housing and it would include lots of affordable housing. And then when they come to actually build them, they shift their stance. And people who deserve to stay living in Lewis because they've been in Lewis all their lives and have family here aren't able to because it is an expensive town to live in, frankly.
And actually, it takes the heart out of the town if you keep on getting new people totally and
Oh,
forcing the
yes.
old ones out.
No,
Um,
completely. Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't, and so there are many people who end up um, heading off to New Haven or Seaford or whatever, somewhere where they can actually afford a place. But in fact, they are proper Louisians in a way that I don't claim to be. I've only been here for 20 odd years. Um, but I like to think I've given uh, something back to the town in the same way that you have, Keith. But
well,
it's a
I've
difficult
been here for
balance.
about 30 years, more than that, and I like to think that I've made contributions in my own specific field. But
Yep.
way back in '97, I got the very first local radio station, albeit only on a temporary license going, and it was very, very popular. And it lasted up until really about 2 years ago under the name of Rocket Radio.
Oh, right.
That
Yeah,
was
I know.
a
Yes.
brainchild, and so that in itself, really, I think should be enough contribution. But also, some people may say, "Oh well, what a waste of space." But this television station is, and because of technology enabling it, is making a valuable contribution. And on various social media sites, we get more and more and more people saying how much they enjoy it. So yes, I believe that
I spend hours writing those, Keith.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, way back when social media first started, I was introduced to somebody in Brighton who had a business, and you could go to the business and you could say to him, "Look, I pay you X amount," and he'd got a team of people that would actually send approval things. So there was nothing real about it. And the other thing is that with something like Facebook, where they boast that they're uploading sort of 2,000 or 3,000 videos an hour, is how the hell does anybody stand any chance whatsoever of getting their videos seen, except for the odd one that does something outrageous? So I think it's all a nonsense. It's more or less you appeal to people that you appeal to, and that's it.
Yes, very much so.
Anyway, it's your show.
Well, Keith, let me tell you, as ever with you, you're serendipitous. I think that's the word I'm looking for. Because I thought today I'd quite like to ask you about, not about modern online internet type reporting, but back in the day when it was when newspapers were newspapers, when that's the way people would get their news, almost by definition. And so I know you did a lot broadcasting down the television, but as I understand it, you also did a significant amount of written work.
Reasonably so. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I kept my teeth on text reporting, and I've written all sorts of things for magazines and so on. I have never worked on Fleet Street at a newspaper, but I did work for 10 years, partly in broadcasting and partly in text. One of the great suppliers of news to newspapers, and that was Reuters.
Right, of course, yes. And just so people know, Reuters is a internationally acclaimed reporting organization, which is deemed to be wholly independent and trustworthy.
Yes, indeed. In fact, some of the great authors of our modern time were reporters for Reuters, and I used to partly amuse me and partly thrill me that when you walked along some of the corridors on its Fleet Street headquarters, there were photographs of four people. Is Edgar Wallace,
Right.
Rudyard Kipling, Ian Fleming, and I think it was the Irish Forsyth, perhaps Frederick Forsyth, and they were clustered together because they had three things in common. They were all famous authors. They all worked for Reuters, and they were all spies.
Well, we know that you're a spy, Keith, so that's absolutely fine.
I mean,
but
now that Putin is beginning to target British spies, is that I'm expecting a knock on the door any day.
No, it will be something will be put in your coffee at the Black Horse.
Oh yes, or somebody will poke me with an umbrella.
Yeah, exactly. The Bulgarian umbrella. Exactly. That will be it. Boom.
um,
But
I think that
uh,
that the
sorry, go
people
ahead.
that I've worked with and trained at Russia Today television in Moscow, which I did for 5 years in a row, sorry, 4 years in a row, is the one standout. I mean, there were many very, very talented reporters, but there's one standout, partly because of her heritage, and partly because she really was quite stunningly beautiful. And I stay in touch with today. It was the young Shabadnadze, Sophie Shabadnadze, and those people who have followed Russian politics will know that Edward was one of the great reformers in Russian politics and could easily have become president. And she was quite delightful and very talented. But now I shall treat her with a little bit of suspicion if she turns up on my doorstep, just in case she's been sent by Putin.
Now, just talking about those days where, sorry, I know this is a bit nostalgia, but it interests me. You're a reporter, you've got a story. How do you check the veracity of what you're being told, or did you have people who could do that for you?
Well, it was six of one and half a dozen of the other. I mean, as a reporter, you were responsible for your story. So you had to be sure that it was accurate yourself, because there was no internet,
No.
no any stuff off the web. Um, but there were two types of story, really. One, and I've mentioned this before, one is you had machines clattering in the corner of the newsroom, and news from around the world uh, coming in from third parties. The usual test of the veracity of these was that you had to have three independent sources. So if something came in and sort of said, Stalin is starving millions of people, you would have to get two other confirmations that this was happening from a source that you trusted before you could use it. But is you would have a network of people. As indeed, I still have a network of people, although I don't use it anywhere near as much as I used to. But to actually confirm that the veracity of what you're reporting. But the other one that I learned later in my career, because I did some work for Dow Jones. I actually trained their text reporters to appear on television and to write television script.
And
And they
just tell us who Down Jones is.
Dow Jones is the big American um, news agent, but it's a bit like Reuters, concentrated on market news and business news and so on, but had a world news section. So it was more or less the same as Reuters, except it was American as opposed to British. And only relatively recently, in the last 10 or 15 years, was it was sold to Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah.
So it's now a Murdoch spin-off, if you like. But in the day when I was working with them, they were absolutely they tested and tested and tested and tested their news stories to make sure they were accurate. Because particularly if they were reporting on the markets, I mean, most average person sort of says, "Oh yeah, well the stock market, and business and so on. But you get one thing wrong, and you can affect a whole economy and alter the course of history almost. And they had something called an enterprise story. And because they had a pretty fair network, they would actually come across a little scrap, and their instinct would be, "Gosh, there seems to be something in this," and they would take a long time developing and getting the evidence to support or otherwise this little scrap of news, which otherwise would not have been seen and would not have been developed and wouldn't have come to light. So that was the sort of the long and the short of it. Fairly instant stuff that you rely upon other people, and the story that you actually developed yourself, and you were absolutely sure about it because you were the author of it.
Yes, you remind me of the story of the Chancellor of the Exchequer who, walking to Parliament to deliver the budget, mentioned something about it to a friend of his who was a journalist waiting. And he ended up resigning because it was deemed to be inappropriate for him to have given that information, which was information about the market, before he announced it in Parliament. Now, nowadays, everything's game, isn't it? It just happens all the time, I'm afraid.
Yes. Well, one of the journalists who has remained a friend, Dow Jones, an American, and has now gone back, works for Bloomberg spin-off. Bloomberg being a financial organization, of course, and his role is whenever there is an announcement being made by the American government or the American stock market, is there are a few reporters that are locked into a room just a few minutes before the announcement is made, and they don't know what it's about, but they know that it's important and they've been alerted, and they have to make a judgment on it literally within seconds.
Yes.
So their expertise. This chap's name is Randy Valerius, and he is one of the finest journalists that I've ever come across. And unlike me, getting excited, is Randy was always very solid and very thoughtful, and yet capable of just being able to get things right literally within seconds, because seconds can make all the difference to markets. People can lose and make fortunes within seconds on a stock market.
I get the feeling, Keith, that you've always been Randy, but that's a different point.
No, don't let my secrets out.
Could I ask you this? When in writing a piece, you have you used to have, when it was print copy, presumably some kind of word count that you weren't able to go over.
Sorry, a workout?
A word count.
Oh, yes. I mean, particularly for electronic media, it is you can't take too much time. Partly because in the space that is given over to news, and much as people will boast about our news is the first, etc., etc., is don't cross Coronation Street with it. So you have to get as much news as you possibly can within a short space of time, which determines basically, in my day, it was 2 minutes and 40 seconds. That was the average length of a news piece. But you would start off perhaps with a piece of 3 minutes because it's important, and end up with a piece of 1 minute 10 seconds or something
And
as it goes down.
Were you able over time to sort of judge that without looking at your watch? You'd know when you were approaching your time limit.
Yes, you developed a mental clock, which I may say it hasn't totally disappeared from my mind now, but at one time I could get 59 seconds when I'm supposed to do a minute, and when I was working in Kosovo, we had to make a report to the American embassy, and the ambassador was there with her advisors, so on and so forth, and several people who were going to make a report. And we were told we had 2 minutes to make these reports. And of course, the people that preceded me, they added a few seconds on, a few seconds on, until in the end they said, Keith, can you make sure that your report is going to be exactly on time? And I said, yes, I can. I'll do 2 minutes worth.
Yeah.
And I did 1 minute and 59 seconds. That amazed them all because they didn't believe that I could do it. I mean, even then, in my Kosovo days, I've still been around in the industry for about 40 years, and you very much, particularly my training was North American. I started my career in Canada, and you those are the sort of things that you are taught first of all is don't run over. So you get a time clock going inside you.
Yes, I have similar experiences, albeit it's easier when you're in court because there is an electronic clock just in front of the judge. But judges will often say, Mr. Barton, how long are you going to be addressing the jury? Now, I know that if I go over the time that I say at that stage, the jury are going to be really annoyed with me and get bored. And so it's a matter of pride for me that if possible, I'm able to say, and therefore that was my 25 minutes. Thank you. Sit down. Because it keeps them happy. Now, Keith, one thing about written journalism that I don't quite understand, but I think I sort of understand, is the role of the sub-editor.
Right.
And their role in terms of headlines.
Well, quite often you'll have what is a leader writer who does nothing but write headlines. I mean, the old Sun prior to Murdoch days, and to some extent the Mirror, used to have brilliant headlines. I mean, you can remember "Up Yours to Laws" was one of the famous ones.
Yes.
And those people to come up with those succinct headlines, attention-grabbing headlines, are paid quite a lot of money. The reporter is the man who has normally gone out and got the information and has written the guts of the article. And a sub-editor will go through and correct English, for instance, or grammar. He will double check if he's got any doubts whatsoever about the authenticity of what the reporter has written, but also will cut the piece down to size if in fact it's running over, because quite often a reporter doesn't have time, particularly in the modern day, to fit. I mean, in the old days, the sub-editor would do all the fitting. Nowadays, the reporter does the fitting himself because he's working to a template that is electronic. So he has to do a lot of it himself. But still, the sub-editor would actually not be responsible for the finished product.
But would be the person writing the headline.
And not necessarily the headline. Sometimes, yes, but the there are people whose sole job is headline writing, the leader writer. They actually well, they would be aware of what the story is about, but they would be responsible for the headline. So, for instance, what was one today? I'm just forgotten already the headlines today, but it might be Britain slips into recession. Hunt told to maintain taxes, something like that, and that would be written by somebody who is familiar with the story, but whose job is solely to come up with those punchy, quick um, headlines, and not bother with writing the guts of the thing, the detail of the thing. In the old days, there's one amusing story told, as that a reporter would go out, and they had these wonderful ladies who would sit in front of typewriters and uh, take the story on the phone, and they could actually listen and they could type the story, but they didn't know what the story was about. They just could hear the words. And in the past, in sort of respectable newspapers like the Times, you would suddenly see in the middle of the copy is "Oh F it," and the, the reporter had made a mistake and then said "Oh F it," and these ladies, because they weren't listening to the import of it, just simply copied down just what they were hearing, so it would appear right in the middle of a story.
I do like the idea of being a headline writer, I've got to say. I think that might be something that I could have a go at. Maybe when I retire, I'll apply for that job.
Well, I mean, it is a special skill, and probably the sort of thing that you do at the moment is because you're very much the spoken word, is would be very good at it. But what we should do is come up with a couple of stories and give you the challenge of writing a headline for it.
Yes, there was a chap at university with me who ended up doing that. And we did a comedy review together. He was very quick-witted and was able to come up with these comedy things that summarized issues very well. Now, Keith, I'd like to ask you also this.
Is your creativity? I think you would find to make it attractive would be tested. I mean, another famous one was when they got the Iraqi leader,
Yes.
and the headline in one paper was "Gotcha."
Yes.
I mean, it's that sort of thinking, whereas quite often a scribe, somebody who's used to writing reports, can't be succinct. They write excellent stories, but they have to write the whole story. Whereas somebody else can look at it and say, I can encapsulate that in 1 or 2 or 3 words.
So summarize it down to something that's really quite memorable.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And as I say, that the Sun at one time was very good at that. It's not as good now,
No.
but it was at one time. It was almost all headlines.
Yes. Yes. Could I ask you this, Keith? What training do reporters get about the law concerning their profession, what they can report and what they can't report?
Well, there are several books on media law, that are standard works. And generally speaking, you're expected to have read one of those. If in fact you go to a media school or take a university media course, that would be standard teaching. You would have a media law, but quite often particularly the bigger organizations, but some medium to small size organizations will keep a solicitor on tap who is an expert in media law, and you're able to pick up the phone and say, look, am I likely to libel, or am I likely to get us into trouble, or is this against the law if I report this? Because in many ways, while reporters will have a good smidgen of law, they're not experts. And as you will well know, the law can be very different in many respects. I mean, I'm sure that you go into court, if you have three cases in a day, is not one of the three will be the same. So for reporters to actually stay up to date with what's happening, in a day's run is very difficult, and it needs expert assistance.
Yes, it's generally governed by the Contempt of Court Act 1981, Section 10, about what can be reported and not reported. But there are other provisions dealing with, for example, child witnesses and things like that. Generally, I've found reporters down the years know those things. I've certainly had one case in the last 3 years where the reporter didn't realize that they'd fallen into error. And I ended up having to phone up their organization and say, this has been uploaded. You need to know that your reporter is putting himself at risk of going to prison, because that's what contempt of court can end up with. So it's a tricky area. Whereas, for example, I have a friend who's a reporter for a national newspaper, and he wanted to write an article about a topic that I have been involved in, a criminal law topic. And we spoke a lot about it, and then he wrote the article, which was very good. And he put it to the editor of his national newspaper, and they said, this involves people who are very rich. We're not going to take the risk. We're not going to publish. And presumably that does happen from time to time, Keith.
Yeah, I took my ear away from you just for a moment because Rupert Lloyd Thomas has sent in a number of comments, and I'm going to read them to you in a minute. No, it's okay. He's very much on the ball. He's listening and viewing us. So Rupert says Julian Thomas, who is his brother, who was a very well-known reporter in both, I believe, Rhodesia, but also in Southeast Asia, is that Julian wrote the headlines for the South China Morning Post, and he was a sub-editor at the South China Morning Post. A reporter would provide a headline. The sub would either accept or change it, which is a bit of the Chinese do it back to front, obviously. And then he says copy takers, referring to something that we talked about. Is a wonderful lady at the Daily Telegraph put a good headline on a dull story. So he's been following what we've been saying and adding to the knowledge, if you like.
I think every broadcast we have, we ought, Keith, if possible, to aim to have a suitable headline for it.
Yes, I think
So
that's right.
I change my name on the link depending on the subject. I might look into that, and then who knows? People
Yeah.
might say it's good, and he can come and become our headline writer, and he doesn't have to do anything other than come up with at the most 5 words every day to summarize a story, and that would be a heck of a job as far as I'm concerned. I've done
You're a wordsmith, are you?
well, I've done plenty of words in my time, certainly. Put it that way. Yeah. So, sources I wanted to ask you about. You're a journalist, you've worked in areas of significant conflict. And journalists often have sources which they're not able to disclose, but who feed them information. How does that work?
Well, it depends upon not so much your seniority, but your experience. I mean, you pick up people as you go along. For instance, when I first came back from Canada, and I was at BRMB in Birmingham, I was the head of news there, and I actually had a policeman whose patrol really took in New Street Station, and the studio was in Aston, not terribly far away. And he actually turned up one day and sort of said, uh, I get all sorts of stories. Are you interested? Now, as a copper, he wanted a few bob in his pocket. There's nothing wrong with that. Informants sometimes do, but he would phone in 3 or 4 stories a day, and we would choose whether we wanted any of them. And he would only get paid on the basis of the stories that we thought were useful. So that was where one came from. But in Canada, for instance, is because I had a good friend, as indeed I have you as a barrister, is he represented the mafia. And so I actually got mafia contacts where other people didn't. And it is I got all sorts of things that tips and hints and stories, and also a bit of a warning is be careful how you treat this, because otherwise you might end up in the ditch, as it were. But but with the mafia, the one thing that I did learn is they are not personal. They don't actually knock you off because they don't like you or because you upset them by calling them a silly name. They only actually knock you off if you have seriously interfered with their business. So that gave you a little bit of a leeway. And in fact, on one famous occasion, is actually he was the son of the former Attorney General, who was also a friend of mine, and he came down to the press room in the courthouse in Vancouver and said, Jerry Trojan is just about to be sentenced, and he's asked if you would come up and say goodbye to him. And Jerry Trojan was one of the soldiers, foot soldiers, the mafia, and they picked him up carrying a suitcase full of heroin. And he was going to go down for 20 or 30 years. And he asked if he could actually see me. he without feeling that he was snitching at all, he gave me a couple of decent stories. Um, so that sort of contact was invaluable. But one other slightly amusing story is I was teaching some people um, in London from Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia. And I was told, God, whoever put this together to ask you to do this, it must be suicidal because you put those three nations together and they will slit each other's throats after they've slit yours. I said to them, right, okay, you are not ethnic in any sense of the word. You are journalists. And the way that journalists operate is that they actually get together and they share information because you can't possibly cover everything. English journalists all meet in the pub, and the reason that they meet in the pub is on Fleet Street is so that they can feed one another, even though they work for different publications. And I jokingly said, you can always tell an English journalist because his right arm goes like that. And then I gave them a story to do to follow up on the weekend. And I came back and I said, "How did you all make out?" And they didn't say a thing. They just went. Sources come from different places. Another story that I followed up was a murder in British Columbia, and because I knew the chief constable, the deputy chief constable quite well. Myself and a reporter from the Vancouver Sun latched onto the fact that the police had got sight of the gun that was used. And we went and had a chat to him, to the chief constable. Nobody else did. And he said it's an RCMP gun. It's been owned by the RCMP. So there was we got a story out of that that was nobody else got at all, and that was because we treated the sources at a very high level, very sensibly and I shouldn't say courteously, but we were discreet. So you get all the sources from all over the place.
Yes, and in terms of, you've talked about obviously paying for information. How does that work with your employer if you're a reporter? Presumably you have to get clearance for it in some way.
Well, to some extent you do, but good journalists are trusted by their editors. I mean, one of the most famous cases, of course, is Woodward and Bernstein, who would actually put the Washington Post in problems. We've got the Batista with us. I'll pump him up. But I mean, the editorial staff and the owner trusted the journalists enough to. We've got a wonderful shot of your stomach there, Philip. But to let them have their head, ultimately, of course, it became so sensitive that they did actually have to have their legal beagles in, and there was a difference of opinion as to what they should do. But generally speaking, is if you reach that level, what you have done is reached a level of confidence in your
Yes.
reporters and in your editorial staff. Sometimes editors are not necessarily good reporters. That they rely upon the skills of people who are journalists more than their knowledge of how to actually handle a story.
I see. Yes. So they're more sort of, obviously, it's more of a management role being an editor.
Yes, it's they sit behind a desk. I was once in the. I'm trying to remember. I think that it was CBS Studios in New York. Um, was it? I don't know. No, perhaps it was a newspaper. I don't know. It's so long ago. But the editor, as it came close to deadline, it must have been a newspaper because they were at deadline. Perhaps it was the New York Times. But the editor stood at the top of the newsroom, which was a great big long news room, and the various section editors would report to him as to what they've got, and he would. I mean, they knew what they were doing throughout the day, but ultimately you might have sort of 20 stories and only room for 15. And he would stand there and they would come and they would report to him and he would determine which stories would go into the paper.
Can I ask you this, Keith? Do you think time is running out for the printed newspaper? I know you use them.
Yeah, people say that. And in fact, in the surge of online newspapers and so on and so forth, online newspapers have never been terribly successful because people expect stuff free online, and the papers can't produce online papers for free, and people are very reluctant to pay for them. So there was a big dip in newspapers, and then it stopped, and it started to climb back up again. And so I think that the written word in a newspaper format, it may not go back to former levels, but its decline has stopped. That's my view. And one of the interesting things is that for years, here in Lewis, I used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning just simply to go and help carry the newspapers into the local newsagent along with two other old boys. And the way that I would determine the popularity and how many newspapers are being sold is to compare the stacks of newspapers each day as they were laid out on the shelf. And it's a pretty good measure.
Do you think the quality of journalism has declined?
Yes, because a lot of people coming out of university now are used to just ripping and reading, and it doesn't take long for dicey PR people, lobbyists, and so on and so forth to find out that they can put stuff up on the web and that it is used without question. Whereas you wouldn't have got that in the past. The three source rule, particularly at national level, was sacrosanct. The other thing is that the people who are now rip and read artists, as it were, have not had the proper journalistic training. Universities, I'm sorry to say, cannot do it. They don't provide the. We've had two or three people, students from Mirador, and first of all, they don't understand the concept of television news, and secondly, they want to change the format the moment that they walk in through the door. They academics don't teach very well journalism. There is one place, Salford University, is I'm full of admiration because the guy that set it up, he put everything together. He put radio, television, newspapers, magazines, and various departments, including advertising and PR, music for jingles and so on and so forth, all into one faculty that was all around a central core, and journalists that came out of Salford won very high marks because they were getting experience.
But presumably, it's an occupation that really requires you to be doing the job as well. It's more an apprenticeship than a.
I think that's true of all sorts of things. As academia skips that bit, and you're absolutely right. And quite often, people who come out of media schools is they walk in through the front door, and some tough-nosed editor says, "Right, go and make the coffee." And the recruit sort of says, "But hang on, I've got a degree. Go and make the coffee." Oh, I don't want to do that. And quite often they disappear from the scene, only to find out that they can't get back into it.
Yes. Yeah.
The unfortunate statistic of people coming out of media schools is that something like 80% of them end up with. I think Philip has had from time to time barista. People in coffee shops as baristas are journalism people with journalism degrees.
Mm. Philip, we've been talking about journalism and being a reporter, and in particular in relation to reporting on papers as opposed to online. I like Keith regret the decline, if not ultimate demise, of the printed press. I don't know what your view is on that.
Yeah, I know why both of you think that. I must confess that I haven't read a hard copy newspaper unless somebody has given me one for quite some time, because as you know, Richard, I'm always on the BBC website. But my experience locally is that hard copy newspapers are still being bought, and considerably so, but of a generation probably beyond yours, mine, and into Keith's. And they're the ones who still want the feel of the paper.
Yes, my parents-in-law have a Daily Mail and a Telegraph every day.
Yes.
And they won't change that. But I don't know anybody younger than me who buys a newspaper. They might look at a Metro because it's free and they pick it up on the train.
Oh, yes. Well, I used to do that. I'm sure you did, Richard. Ironically, what I cannot stand is reading books on devices, Kindles, stuff like that. That's where I am like you are with newspapers. I really need the book, the whole experience of it, and the ease of reference once you're familiar with it. But no, I have to say, if by some piece of luck I do go out and most of the pubs in Arundel still do hard copy newspapers. And there are minimum four outlets, shops and a newsagent per se, that still sell considerable amounts of newspapers, particularly at the weekends. The weekend jobs are very popular because it's not just they're bulky, but they are very varied and generally very informative. I'm reassured to hear from Keith that it dipped, stopped, and crept back up a bit. That's good to hear.
Well, I don't think that the newspaper publishers have quite found the right formula. What I find is trying to read newspapers online is I can read 5 minutes worth, but if I settle down for a newspaper, I can read through it for an hour non-stop.
Yeah,
I get that. It's really something to do with the biological side of things as well.
No, I get that, and what I think, and you hit upon it, is that online articles are really précises. They're short bursts as opposed to the more, I think, in-depth article you would get in a newspaper. But a little anecdote. I mean, I have a very, very good friend who's now, like you, Keith, in his 80s, who lives in Littlehampton. And he has a bevy of granddaughters, and it's a complete dynasty. And one of them went to Salford University to do journalism. She now works for the BBC in Sussex. And she is sent to the locus in quo, to the scene of the crime, the scene of whatever. And she also prepares her own broadcasts on Radio Sussex. So that's a success story. And I'm confident in saying she went to Salford Uni.
Yes, I was brought up to begin with on radio in North America, in Canada, where there's a proliferation. I mean, in Vancouver, there were 8 local radio stations with a population of approximately, in those days, 400,000. So we did everything. We wrote the script. We read it. We went out reporting, and so on. But it is not it's not usual here. And when I came back to Britain, they had in the budget they had 14 people, 2 journalists, and all sorts of other support people, and I wiped the whole lot out. And had 14 journalists and said, what we do is we recruit people who can do it all. And it was revolutionary, but it worked.
Good. I mean,
Keith, the bare-bummed revolutionary. Just think about that.
The trouble is that I've always been a rebel in media, always doing things which nobody had ever either thought of or thought were absolute maniac approaches to things. But the thing is, the practicality is that a lot of this, if you trust people to develop skills, they will.
Richard, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good.
I had a bit of a wobble earlier this week.
Right.
But it was just a sudden drop in blood pressure.
Yeah.
And plenty of fluid, and I was back having my bum spanked whilst I made dinner for people in my house.
Well, that you've always liked that, haven't you?
It's been a hobby of mine for a while, I confess.
But I mean, getting your daughters to do it is a bit much. I mean, Becky maybe.
Don't be horrible. No, it's Jed that does that.
Maybe you could train. Yeah, you could train Jed to do it.
Yeah.
Now, before we go,
intruding, I just thought I'd come in and say hello because I got back earlier than I thought.
It's good to see you.
You did. Is one of the things for both of you. Rupert Lloyd-Thomas, who has made some comments this morning, asked on Wednesday whether the two of you would comment on the post office situation. So I wonder whether perhaps you could give it 5 minutes on Monday to answer his query. Because actually, strangely enough, Rupert worked for IT at the post office in the late 90s.
No, it was on my sort of list of things to talk about. And so
that's fine by me.
Yeah, because absolutely fine.
There are more revelations coming out per week, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dreadful. But okay, Monday 9 o'clock.
Indeed. Look forward to it.
Yes.
Lovely. Have a good
weekend. Thank you, Keith. If I may say, Keith, your I don't want to say contribution, because in fact you were doing it all. I have to say, what you were telling me I found enormously illuminating about your profession. And I would hope other people would agree with that, because I learned a lot from what you told us today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, in some ways, some of the things that I've been telling you are a snapshot, because it is a very complicated profession, and with many different areas. I mean, we didn't get anywhere near into magazines or
No.
opinions. I mean, one of the interesting things which we might talk about a little bit one morning is, for instance, when I was in Kosovo, the media had been under authoritarian rule, and suddenly were allowed to have their head, and they interpreted that as being able to do whatever they wanted, and we had to sort of show them that they needed responsibility along with their reporting, because they actually destroyed the reputation of the MD of an IT company, and when I challenged them is about the stories they were writing, is but everybody knows that. I mean, what do you mean everybody knows that? Well, it's generally known. Where's your evidence? Well, we're media. No, you don't just just say what the hell you think you can say or do say. You've got to actually treat what you say with the basic responsibility of knowing what the hell you're talking about and making sure that your facts are right. So that there's no such thing as sort of waving the hands and just because you don't like somebody fabricating stories.
Well, Keith, it's been a great pleasure to see you in action, albeit for a short while, without the Dolby effect.
Yes.
Wednesday was just extraordinary. He was so impatient to get on.
Yes, that's right.
So just so I know, when I do it with Prideaux in a couple of weeks, on a Wednesday morning, Dolby does from 10 o'clock. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. Well, I think JP and I need to finish about 10 to 10.
I think 5-2 is good enough. I mean, I like to finish at about 5-2 anyway. We've gone over a little bit this morning, because as you add on minutes, so it becomes you push the next person down the line. Now I have the option of saying, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll not stop until midday. But one of the things that I have to be very careful about is that viewer capacity to absorb is limited.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, Keith, I was asleep for most of what you said in the last hour, I have to tell you.
Okay.
All right, lovely.
The Chief of Staff is here.
Yeah, hello, Declan.
Yeah, good morning, Declan. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Declan.
Right. Yes, everything's great this morning, yeah.
How do yourselves?
Yeah.
I'll leave you all to it.
All right.
See you Monday.
See you Monday.
Okay. Take care. There we go. An interesting morning. Next, Mark maybe is up. So we'll go and actually, I think no. I'm going to just let me cut myself off very sharply and go and get Mark.